Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burek of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. He used to work for Geo Investing, which researched Chinese company frauds. Now he has a very popular podcast. He tells it like it is. He calls it like he sees it. He does not apologize for having no filter, and that's why we love him. Christopher Irons of QTR Research, thank you for joining me.
What's up, buddy? How are you, Jason?
You like the introduction there?
That's accurate and well done, man. And congratulations on your channel doing exceptionally well. It's very much deserved.
And I didn't cuss during it, so some of the listeners there are not going to get angry with me.
Yeah, I just don't care about what anybody says. You know, if you waste too much time worrying about what one listener here or there says, do this, do that, you just drive yourself insane. It's like we were just talking about. The best thing to do is just be yourself. And if people like it, then they'll follow your stuff. And if they don't like it, then they can go listen to something else. But I don't understand people that willingly listen to podcasts just to complain about them, like they're being forced to listen to them. I've had people write several complaints about my podcast over and over and over again. And it's the same person. And I'm like, why are you still listening? Go listen to Suze Orman. Go listen to anything else. Oh, I always do. Yeah, I find it funny. I tell people to rate my show 1 star on purpose. It's just, I just don't care. I really don't. There's so many things going on in the world today, Jason, that whether some guy rates me a 1 star on the iTunes store or not falls very low in my list of priorities in my life. Very high in my list of priorities in life is this glass of wine that I have here. So I like to keep my priorities in order.
So let's talk about some of the craziness that has happened in the last only 3 months. Cornerstone Macro just put out an interesting chart. They tallied up the amount of central bank intervention, not just the Federal Reserve, but all of them. They tallied up the amount of fiscal stimulus from all these different governments. And the total they came up with in only a couple months since all this coronavirus outbreak global pandemic started is $20 trillion. But when we see the details of who actually got the liquidity injections, who got the bailouts, it was hedge fund managers like Ray Dalio, the big shot hedge fund managers that were doing the risk parity trade and the basis trade. It was private equity guys lobbying Jerome Powell and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who got the rules changed so that their companies, these private equity guys and their commercial real estate investments, at least temporarily, could get access to capital. But Chris, the people on Main Street, the average Joe, the average Jane, it seems they got the shaft again. What are your thoughts on this?
I think you're 100% right. And I think it was you, actually, that put out a tweet a couple of weeks ago saying, this isn't capitalism, this is crony capitalism. And the problem is, and Peter Schiff says this all the time, the problem is that capitalism is going to get the blame here. When what's going on right now is not free market capitalism. So it's like if you're a free market capitalist, you're getting the worst of both worlds because you're not getting free market capitalism right now. And when it comes time to assign blame for the mess that we're in and the mess that we are going to be in as a result of the monetary policy that we've adopted, free market capitalism is going to get the blame, even if that's not what's happening. And then as a result of that, morons who don't understand anything about monetary policy, specifically many people on the left, are going to start to try to usher in socialism. And that is going to make, that would be 2 wrongs not making a right. And it's a sad state of affairs. I mean, you talk about $20 trillion globally, and it raises so many questions, none of which are being talked about on the financial media, none of which are being talked about in general. What are the consequences of printing that much money? What are the consequences of the debt that we continue to carry and the debt that these other countries continue to carry? What are the consequences if one country decides that they don't want to play the fiat currency game anymore and they want to kind of step off this life raft with the rest of the major central banks that all kind of had this unwritten pact with each other that fiat is okay and that this monetary policy is okay? What happens if China decides they don't want to do that anymore? What happens if Japan decides they don't want to do that anymore? What are the consequences of those actions? And furthermore, there's the obvious question of what are the consequences? Let's just talk about the United States. I mean, I think the U.S. Federal Reserve is going to print somewhere in the realm of 10 to 12 trillion of that $20 trillion. And the problem for people on Main Street is that they are going to bear the cost, the inflationary cost of that money printing without getting the other side of the equation. So what happens is when you increase the money supply by that much, the purchasing power of the dollar eventually starts to fall, even though that money for the most part stays parked, at investment banks and places where it's not going to hit consumer prices, and it may hit other assets and things like that. Essentially, that money is going to bail out the rich. And the problem is that there is still an inflationary cost that has to be paid for that money that's being printed. And if you print $10 trillion in the U.S., that's something around the area of $40,000 to $50,000 per U.S. citizen. I did the math one day. It's something like maybe $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 per person. So far in our bank accounts, most Americans and most people on Main Street, people that listen to your show, have only gotten $1,200 of that. Or if they've, been a success and they have done well, they're being rewarded by the government by not getting anything. They've crossed the threshold where they're no longer entitled to the money that they're paying the inflationary cost for. So far, Main Street has gotten $0 to $1,200 per person, yet we're going to be bearing the future inflationary cost of an additional, $38,000 or $48,000 per person. And that will show up in consumer prices eventually. It will show up in assets. And the $1,200 is going to seem like absolutely nothing at that point. It already seems like absolutely nothing. So the rest of that money, and I put out a tweet a couple of weeks ago that says you don't even need to know where the other $38,000 per person is going to know that you're getting fucked. And that's the story, right? The story is, where is that other $38,000 per person going if we're not getting it? I remember Ron Paul saying after the TARP bailout in 2008 that we could have cut a check to every single American for $10,000 or $15,000 with that money. So why didn't we do that? Why do we continue to think that the government is going to be better capital allocators? And the answer is it's crony capitalism. It's the rich helping the rich. It's the people in the, circles of control helping one another. It's like you said, it's the people lobbying Jerome Powell. It's the people, Jim Cramer has Steve Mnuchin on fucking speed dial. You remember that CNBC episode like 2 or 3 months ago when this whole thing first started going down? Cramer had to take a phone call in the middle of one of his live video feeds, and you could see Steve Mnuchin's name on the cell phone, right? So you have Mnuchin talking to Jim Cramer. It's just a circus. It is a circus. And Main Street, unfortunately, will pay the price. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. Main Street will pay the price, but Jim Cramer and Steve Mnuchin are buddies from Goldman Sachs, so they go back a long way. They're friends. That's why, he's calling in. That's why he's getting preferential treatment. That's why he's not probably getting asked nearly the hard questions, at least by Jim Cramer, that he is maybe on other programs. But you brought up some interesting points there. You said socialism. I mean, I would argue that we've already had a good amount of socialism. I think central banks are a form of socialism. You have the Communist Party platform saying a central bank is required. So central banks are a form of socialism. You have tons of rules, regulations, and taxes. Chris, even though we have, potentially debt deflation now and all these bailouts, I don't think people's taxes are going to go down. I see governments at all these different levels are going to look for new sources of taxes coming up in the near future. The other thing is with the $1,200 check, we have a lot of small business owners, and they listen, a lot of them listen to my podcast. They applied for SBA loans and they didn't get them, but who was getting the SBA loans? And I think the rules were changed, and I think a lot of these large companies were getting the SBA loans instead.
Yeah, I think, we saw even also Harvard got a, $1.2 million or whatever from the government. All these entities that really didn't need the money were getting it. And meanwhile, you have people on Main Street and people with small businesses. And I live in a suburb, and I live on the border of between suburbia and a rural area. And so there's a village near me that has a lot of tiny little shops, and I see it firsthand. I know the people that run the places, and I'm watching them struggle. Meanwhile, there are people abusing the PPP system. There are people, Jason, that from this government, the problem is when the government starts to hand out tons and tons and tons of money, there's no limit to the amount of pigs that will make their way to the trough, number one. Like the private jet industry, all this nonsense. Second thing is the government doesn't really have any efficient means to track where this money is going. So you wind up getting all this waste, fraud, and abuse. And, meanwhile, you have hardworking people like you, who's trying to make your own content and make a living off of it, like me, who I've never worked less than 2 jobs since I've been 18 years old, and I'm 37 now. Like your listeners who are small business owners and, just your everyday middle America people. You have us, grinding it the fuck out on the daily basis, grinding it out. People like my dad, who was a mailman, for decades, 6 days a week, working 12-hour days. And then all of a sudden this program comes around, and all the people that can figure out a way to just scam the system, are going to be retiring off the government loans that you and I both know will be forgiven at some point, and the government has no reasonable expectation of ever collecting those. So you have the Fed, which is the world's worst counterparty. It's just an awful system that rewards people that don't work, and it incentivizes people to be careless with their money and careless with their capital allocation. And it punishes people who are careful with their capital allocation and who work and who generate productivity. The whole system it's disgraceful. And I agree with your point too about socialism and central banks.
Yeah, I mean, we've already had forms of socialism for decades. That government just keeps getting bigger, more rules, more regulations, more taxes, and then the bailouts. And then the convenient excuse, it's heads we win, tails you lose, where capitalism just gets blamed. Meanwhile, the government, I can guarantee you, the size of the government's probably not going to fall until the dollar loses world reserve currency status. Until that point, the size of government at all levels, at the federal, state, and local levels, it's going to keep growing. They're going to find new sources of tax revenue. Look at the bailouts that are being negotiated for different levels of government. And then you have these cocky politicians, these, I call them tin pot dictators, whether it's the governor of Michigan or the mayor of LA, with all these crazy rules and regulations, turning in your neighbor, snitches get paid, mothers on playgrounds getting with their children getting arrested. I could go on. The gym owner in New Jersey who tried to reopen the gym, on and on and on. All the salon owner in Dallas. It's just ridiculous that we've come to this point.
Well, and the government would have a lot of balls to raise taxes after just printing $10 trillion. Okay, tax revenue, I think the government brings in is something to the effect of $3.5 trillion per year. And so what is middle America going to say when the government says we need to raise your taxes because we need to fund this, this, and this, after they just watch these guys bail out all their friends and print money out of nowhere? Why do we need taxes then? If the strategy of printing money is as foolproof as they say it is, and of course we know that it isn't, right? But why do we need taxes then? What do you need our $3.5 trillion per year for if we're just going to run up the national debt and we're just going to blow up the money supply. So they would have a lot of balls to do something like that. But I think you're right. I think they will probably do it. And they'll cite the coronavirus pandemic and the economic slowdown and all this other stuff as a reason to do it. Hey, we got to get back on our feet. We got to, turn the ship around, whatever. The problem is that not enough people out there listen to content like yours, so they don't really understand why that is so farcical and why it's the wrong thing to do, and really why it's insulting and people should be insulted by it. And so they will just kind of unfortunately lie down and take it. I mean, hopefully they will vote against people that have those policies, but nobody runs on raising taxes. They do it after they get elected. In terms of the size of government, I think you're 100% right. I mean, look at how the government grew after 9/11. Look at, we have now the Department of Homeland Security. We have the TSA. It's funny, I was reading a book the other day where two guys are going to Los Alamos National Lab in the 1980s, and they're talking about the security protocols to get in there. And Los Alamos National Lab is somewhere that they do a lot of national defense projects, and it's really one of the top scientific labs in the United States. And they were talking about how they got through security, and they were like, well, yeah, we just waved to the guard and we just made our way in. And that's how things used to be before 9/11. And then everything changed after 9/11, especially air travel and things like that. So I think that, going forward, things are only going to get itemized and surveilled and tracked even more, and government is only going to get bigger. And they will use the pandemic as the excuse. They're already doing it in China. They're already tracking people's phones. They're already, people have to check in at places when they go to them. I mean, there's 1.5 billion people in the country, and the government wants to know where they all are at all times and who's calling who. I mean, it's absolutely frightening, and it's just wild. And, I think you're right. I think we'll head in that direction here. But the problem is nobody asks these important questions. Like, why do we need to pay taxes if the government can just print money? That's a great question that I just want an answer for, because you can't have both. You can't say that what you're doing now is a fiscally sound strategy to deal with this crisis and then come back and say, oh, we need your $3 trillion. You can't, because if that's the case, if it's so fiscally sound, just print the $3 trillion, But the government, they like to have their cake and eat it too from the citizens of the United States. So they'll do both. They'll screw you with inflation, and then they'll take your tax money too.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's likely to happen in the not too distant future. I mean, we've already had stagflate and tax and lie for a while, but to add to your points there about less freedom too, have you seen that Johns Hopkins University is recommending now that 100,000 new agents are hired for contact tracing? So anyone who's infected, these contact tracing agents would be similar to like TSA or they would be the version of the TSA hired after 9/11, and they would go around trying to find all the other people that you interacted with and potentially test them or arrest them or at least quarantine them. And that, obviously that would cause economic damage to themselves and their families.
First off, that's a completely insane thing to do for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the infringement upon our civil liberties. It's insane because it would require an infinite amount of resources, and it would require people of, triple-digit IQs. And no slight to the fine folks at the Department of Homeland Security, but if you've ever traveled, the people that work at TSA, many of whom are lovely people that I enjoy seeing when I go to the airport, some of them are not. I could actually go so far as to say a good portion of them are not. They're not the brightest tools in the, they're not the brightest, as I fuck my analogy up. I'm talking about how stupid people are, and I can't even put a sentence together. They're not the sharpest tools in the shed, is what I'm trying to say. So what's the government going to do? They're going to go out and they're going to hire 100,000 people that will work for $15 an hour, and they're going to give them, you know, super government powers to go out and take note of every time some guy goes to 7-Eleven to buy a Slurpee. All right. First off, asinine because of the civil liberties angle. That's number one. Number two, asinine because it would require a significant amount of resources and would really necessitate hiring the best and the brightest, which the government does not have a fantastic track record of doing. Number three, it's asinine because contact tracing is a fucking afterthought at this point, and I'll tell you why. Number one is within a year, within 12 months from now, we're going to have a vaccine for this fucking thing, okay? So the problem will be dealt with in the best way possible, and there will be a vaccine for it. So by the time they spin up a stupid-ass program like that, the problem's already going to be gone, all right? So there's going to be no point of having, you know, 100,000 people at the ready for contact tracing when vaccines are going to be available to everybody. The second other reason why it's ridiculous to do that is because the virus is everywhere. I mean, I really think that the virus has spread way more than people think. People look at the data and they think that they're watching this thing spread in real time. When you think about the reality of the situation, Jason, what's the reality? The reality is that China disclosed the first case as far back as November. All right. China has a history of lying, but let's take them at their word on November. I mean, I think it would be better to say October just to be safe, but let's take them on their word that November was the first case. You know, this thing jumped from a bat to a human in November, or it came out of the lab and infected a human, you know, in November it got out. And let's say it was November 15th. Between November 15th and the travel ban, that wasn't really a travel ban, in late January. Well, what happened? Okay, you have tens of millions of people moving around in China domestically on flights on the daily, and you have people moving internationally from China to all major cities all across the globe every single day. If you're not an expert on air travel, there's something like 10,000 or 100,000 flights happen every day. I don't know the number, but it's absurd the amount of flights that happen on a daily basis. Each flight, let's say on average, has 75 to 100 people. Then you throw in the fact that you got Thanksgiving, you have university break, so all the Chinese students are going home from U.S. universities and then coming back, and vice versa. Not only domestically in China, but Chinese students that are studying in Italy, Italian students that are studying in China, this, that, and the other. You got all these people shuffling back and forth all of November, all of the Thanksgiving holiday, all of December, all of Hanukkah, all of Christmas, all of Kwanzaa, all of New Year, all of New Year's Day. I mean, hey, I was at the goddamn airport on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, okay? There were people everywhere. And then you had, you know, the next 2 weeks in January before universities came back into session, all right? Winter break was ending. And people, they go home to China and then they go vacation somewhere or vice. So you have an unbelievable amount of people shuffling across the globe from November to the quote-unquote travel ban. And by the way, there were still flights coming and going to Beijing every day during the travel ban in late January. So this thing has made its way across the globe, in my opinion. And I think when we get ubiquitous antibody testing, so everybody knows there's two types of tests, one that shows you whether or not you have the virus now, and one that shows you whether you've developed the antibody for it, which means that you've had it in the past. I think when antibody testing becomes widely available, we're going to find out that this thing has made inroads across the United States in ways that we haven't even possibly imagined. When we find that out, the idea of contact tracing is going to be laughable. More so than it is already laughable. If this was Ebola, and there was an 80% fatality rate, okay, then contact tracing would be a little bit more of a priority. It wouldn't be as infectious because people would be dying instead of walking around spreading it. But if you had something that was a little bit more fatal and a little bit more infectious, maybe. But I think Sweden has the right idea in this case, which is this thing is going to make its way across the globe no matter what we do, Jason. You know, the idea of flattening the curve wasn't to stop the virus in its tracks. It was just to make it so that our healthcare systems were able to take people in and not be overwhelmed. But from the beginning, people forget that the end game here is that this thing makes its way all over the globe. And that's, you know, it's unfortunately what has to happen. And there is no possible way for us to prevent it. Just being real, there is no realistic way for us to be able to prevent it. So that whole idea of contact tracing, I think, is ridiculous. And I think it's asinine for all of those reasons.
Yeah, and I think with contact tracing, the only way that the government thinks that it could get this done is with big technology. So your Googles, your Facebooks, your Apples, all allowing the phones to track or sense the data to tell if you're sick. So then the phones, as much as the smartphones spy on us now, it would have to spy on us even more, because then it wouldn't rely on those agents, like you said, that wouldn't be doing a good job. It would mostly be technology that would be doing the tracking, doing the spying.
Yeah, it's just a terrible idea all around. I mean, it's bad enough that right now, I mean, most people, 9 out of 10 people that have a phone don't know that when they go to the mall, you know, the mall is collecting their phone's data and then turning around and selling that to hedge funds. I mean, it's a very real thing that happens. Actually, it was the New York Times did a great article about it, following people through New York City just based on their cell phone activity. And that data is everywhere. And it is sold. It's sold to focus groups. It's sold to marketing professionals. It's sold to hedge funds. I mean, we're already at a point, Jason, where we can't leave our house and not be on camera. We can't travel down the highway in our cars and not have the Easy Pass pick up exactly where we are. I mean, if I want to go from my house to Atlantic City and I want to go on like a covert gambling trip, right? And I don't want to tell anybody. I want to go down and play poker for 3 days and I want the world to fucking leave me alone. You know, the steps that I have to take to hide the fact that I'm not in Philadelphia anymore and I'm in Atlantic City are immense. And even then you wind up slipping up. Even if you stay off Facebook and you stay off Instagram and you try to, you know, use just your Wi-Fi on your phone and you take your Easy Pass out of your car and, you know, you just can't do it anymore. Contact tracing takes that to the nth degree. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some real pushback on something like that. And again, very important to note, Jason, that the virus is going to make its way across the globe, whether we have contact tracing or not. You know, I don't have any problems with social distancing. I don't have any problems with wearing a mask. I don't have any problems with the idea of flattening the curve. I think it's all super important stuff. I think that we need to protect the people that are most vulnerable. I haven't seen my parents in a couple of months. It's, you know, very upsetting. I really would like to see them, but, you know, they're older and we want to make sure that we're not exposing each other. You know, I have a very close family friend who had a family member die from this, had a pre-existing condition as well, but unfortunately passed away from this. So I'm not trying to say this isn't serious, but I'm also trying to be pragmatic and trying to be realistic.
Well, I think governments have screwed this up. I think no matter how you spin it, I think all these different governments, whether it's the Chinese government, the U.S. government, European governments, all these governments at all different levels.
Well, the Chinese government is lying. The Chinese government has lied from day one, and they continue to lie. And the problem is, here's another big problem that I have beef with. When we read an article, Jason, and especially these articles that condemn the job the United States is doing based on the numbers that we have, you know, this is Paul Krugman tweeted something out about this a couple of months ago, showing a chart of all the nations of the world and the U.S. with, you know, the most amount of deaths. And Paul Krugman's Twitter feed is essentially a giant anti-Trump feed and pro-Federal Reserve feed at any given time. And he said, you know, we're really failing as a nation or something like that. And there were a couple problems that I had with that. And I actually wrote an article about it. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to look real quick to find out the title so that I can tell your readers if, or your listeners rather, if you don't mind. Just give me 1 second, because I'm proud of this article and I think it makes some very good points. The article is called "China's Playbook for Blaming the U.S. For Coronavirus Could Be Working," and I wrote it on March 30th. And the gist was based on that Krugman article, because the higher numbers in the U.S., Jason, the death count, the infection numbers, all that is a testament to the amount of testing that we're doing relative to other countries. Okay, we've done a significantly more amount of testing than many other countries combined. And when you look at a chart, in the U.S. has this, you know, line that looks like a, you know, what do they call that when something stands out? It looks like a
hockey stick.
Yeah, but it looks like you know, like an exception to everybody else's data. The U.S.
An outlier.
An outlier is the word I'm looking for. Thank you. The U.S. data looks like an outlier, Jason. The only reason for that is because China isn't reporting their real numbers. If China was reporting their real number of infections and their real numbers of deaths, their country would look like the fucking outlier, not the United States. So Krugman, who I don't expect much, I mean, in terms of the guy's intellect or anything coming from him, and I don't want to bash Krugman. He's doing the best with the brain that he has, I guess. But China also has been tweeting, and we're tweeting in March and April, that, oh, the U.S. has really dropped the ball because look at how bad their numbers are. And it's like, the numbers wouldn't look that bad if you guys were telling the truth. So you can't tell me that China has a country of 1.5 billion people, all of whom, by the way, in these major cities are basically standing shoulder to shoulder at all times. I don't know if you've ever seen people in crowded cities in China. They have 1.5 billion people, and they're reporting, you know, 7 new cases a day, 3 new cases a day. Give me a fucking break, okay? And the worst part is, all of the stories that we write in the U.S., the New York Times, Bloomberg, CNBC, all the major outlets, when they talk about the U.S. testing data, and they never hesitate to take a shot at the president or a shot at the job that the administration's doing, they never hesitate to do that. None of them put an asterisk next to China. None of them say, hey, the numbers we're using here are up in question. Even the United States government has said that we don't think that those numbers are real. So yet, when it's convenient for their narrative, they would rather take shots at the job that we're doing in the United States based on this nonsense data from China. And Jason, I'm not a fucking Make America Great Again hat-wearing Trump supporter, okay? I'm a libertarian, all right? I'm just trying to look at things objectively. I was critical of Trump, very critical of Trump in February when he responded to the pandemic in what I thought was a very flippant way. You know, we have 15 cases and they're going to 0. Everybody knows that line because it was stupid. And I said that night, that line might have cost him the election. But it wasn't really maybe 2 weeks, I think, before he changed his tune. I think it was mid-February. He had appointed the coronavirus task force. He had put Mike Pence in charge, and they started to hold daily briefings. And the first couple of briefings I thought were really not good. And then all of a sudden, the tone changed and they became very serious. And since then, I think that they had done about as satisfactory of a job as you would expect, you know, a large government to do. So the reason that, you know, this idea of taking shots at the United States for the job that we're doing containing this problem, which would have never been an issue, but not for China, okay, is ridiculous. And we're so ass backwards in this country, Jason, that instead of paying attention to the problem itself, we're standing around arguing over whether or not we should call it the Wuhan coronavirus.
Yeah, and everyone gets called racist now if they do that. And there's a ton of people in the mainstream media just ganging up on people. You're right that the Chinese government is not getting the criticism from Western mainstream media. And I think a lot of that is because they do pay a lot for advertising from Western mainstream media. China Uncensored and many other journalists have covered this. The Chinese government pays hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, per year for positive news coverage, especially on their economic stuff. And the firm you used to work at, Geo Investing, which was featured heavily in the China Hustle documentary with Dan David and Carson Block and others, you know, now we're seeing more and more examples of accounting fraud out of China. And the U.S. and China relations, do you think that the U.S. and China relations are just going to get worse from here? Because we're just seeing all these, and now it seems daily now, Chris, back and forth. You know, Trump says that U.S. retirement savings are not going into China, talking about how Chinese companies should not be listed, and then the Chinese government issues a press release. Do you expect then like a much, much worse Cold War and deglobalization to occur then?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I'm not a geopolitical analyst, but what I can tell you from my own experience is that China and U.S.-listed China-based companies have been ripping off American investors to the tune of tens of billions of dollars for a decade now. I'm saying this as somebody that's, I just read the Luck and Coffee news and I'm just going to opine on it. I did the work on it, okay? Like you said, I worked for Geo Investing for 5 years. I worked for Dan David for 5 years. I mean, I was his senior equity analyst and his senior writer on a lot of the projects that he did. I mean, that was my title working under him. So I was in the shit of it for, a decade. And there's a couple of things going on here. I could get into the weeds on this. I did a speech in Las Vegas last year. It's on my YouTube channel. It's called Our Bullshit Economy. And in that speech, I lay out how I came to work at Geo and what we found out from working there. And also, like you said, Jason, the China Hustle is a fantastic documentary. If you want to know what exactly is going on here, you can get it, I think, on Amazon Prime. It's like $2. If you're looking for a movie to rent tonight, it's one of the best documentaries you could ever watch, especially if you're involved in the world of finance and investing. Essentially, what has happened is U.S. listed, and you said accounting fraud, Jason. You're giving a lot of these companies credit. Some of them, it wasn't even accounting fraud. It was just the company doesn't exist fraud. I mean, it's a form of accounting fraud.
So is
right?
this
but
like,
this wasn't just
this
wasn't just channel stuffing or, goosing the receivables. This was like the factory doesn't fucking exist. And the problem is that the people that list the companies, the people on the New York Stock Exchange, the people on NASDAQ, and the big four auditors that are tasked with auditing these companies, they don't do the due diligence. They don't check for fraud. They will collect their fees and they want to keep it moving. And all we had to do to discover fraud in many of these cases was go to where these headquarters were supposed to be. Oh, you've got a plant in Guangzhou, China. Great. Let's go there with a camera and count how many trucks are going in and out of the factory on a daily basis. Oh, well, we found out after a week that not only are 0 trucks going in and out, but the fucking gate is boarded up and the rail spur looks like it hasn't been used in 10 years. That's not a company that's producing oil on a daily basis like they claim they are. It was that kind of fraud. And that kind of fraud continues. Luckin Coffee is a wonderful example. What was happening at Luckin Coffee? Like 90% of their sales were fake. And no auditor caught it, Jason. The New York Stock Exchange didn't catch it. The Securities and Exchange Commission, they probably wanted to catch it, but China has laws now that forbid them from working with U.S. securities regulatory agencies. How did that blow up? It blew up because Muddy Waters and Carson Block put out a report detailing how the fraud was occurring, and that forced the hand, probably of the auditor, Ernst & Young, to take a deeper look. And when they did, what did they find out? I don't know, Jason, but the stock was at 30 then, and it's at 1 now, probably on its way to fucking 0. So, and Luckin Coffee, Jason, Luckin Coffee was a, this isn't some obscure over-the-counter. This was talked about every day on CNBC. This was a major company. This had major shareholders, Morgan Stanley, all these big investment banks. This wasn't and Carson Block said it best on my podcast. He said, everybody just kind of assumes that China companies are a fraud now. And it's just, what degree of fraud are they committing? If it's not a lot, then people will just invest in them anyways, because it's just kind of become the norm. So when you think about that, and you think about the $15 billion in market cap that we helped expose in fraud over the last decade, you think about those two things combined, and you start to look at all these U.S.-listed Chinese companies. Well, what's going on at Alibaba? I don't know. How much transparency do we have there? How many U.S. investors are involved there? What does their entity structure look like? How many VIEs do they have? What's going on in the Cayman Islands? Have they verified all their accounting journal entries? How do they keep track of inventory? Meanwhile, Jack Ma is just taking out loans from U.S. banks while all of these major questions loom. And I'm not saying Alibaba is a fraud, but what I'm saying is it is a massive multi-$100 billion company listed on U.S. exchanges that is based in China, and its disclosures are hidden behind a cloak of opacity, similar to the way that if you ever try to read Alibaba's annual report, forget about it. The amount of entities and subsidiaries and things that they have, it's like reading hieroglyphics. So the idea of delisting all of these companies, or at least, Jason, trying to get them to play by the same rules, is they don't have to abide by PCAOB standards. They don't have to abide by U.S. accounting standards. We at least need that. But the idea of delisting them all, based on what I have seen personally, is not a bad idea. The Chinese are far more shrewd and far smarter and far better business people and far sharper than we give them credit for. They are extremely sharp, and they found a way to siphon money from U.S. investors. And when they found out years ago that it worked, and that even when these things go bust, they pay pennies on the dollar in fines and nobody goes to jail. So that's a great business model for them, Jason. Why the hell wouldn't they keep doing that? And that's what they continue to do. And you almost can't even blame them. There's no repercussions for them in China. You almost can't even blame them for doing it. The problem is that these U.S. listed entities, not only are they held by retail investors that don't understand that when they're buying shares of a Chinese ADR, they're not buying shares of stock in a corporation like normal U.S. companies, but they're tied in 3, 4, 5 degrees of separation to index funds that people hold in their retirement funds. They're tied into mutual funds. They're tied in many different ways, tied and tangled in with the retirement and pension funds of the United States of America. And we have two options. One is to rip the Band-Aid off now, Jason, and just say, you know what? You can't come on our exchanges anymore, which may hurt for a second, and then it'll be better in the long run. Or we can wait and watch one Luckin Coffee after the other blow up and sit around and stare at each other with stupid looks on our face, wondering why we keep allowing this to happen and when we're going to do something about it.
Yeah, I get people asking me on a daily basis about Chinese coal companies, about all different type, about Silver Corp, which was mentioned. They're a silver mining company that was actually specifically mentioned in China Hustle documentary. I still get messages and emails all the time asking if Silver Corp's a good company, and I say, please go watch the China Hustle documentary. Go read Denny McMahon's book, China's Great Wall of Debt. He talks about that too in detail, and people just ignore it. I guess they're hoping that they find the one that doesn't have, like Carson Block said, too much fraud, or the one example, the one company that doesn't have any fraud. I guess people are hoping for that.
Well, I don't give investment advice, so I'm not going to give investment advice, but there really is no reason to own any company based in China. There are so many great ways to make money on equities, listed in the U.S., listed anywhere else. But even in the U.S., you know, you got 15 or 20,000 listed public companies. Any given day, there's a company that's making a 52-week low that's going to double or triple off of that if you hold it for a year or two. You just got to find out which one it is. There's really no excuse and no reason, in my opinion, to own anything that's based in China, because you don't know what you own. You might wake up the next day and lose 95% of your investment. It's that simple.
And Mr. Bull Market, and also, Chris, to add to your point there, you know, Jim Rogers, Mr. Bull Market in commodities, Mr. Chinese growth story. He's been repeating this for 20 years. He has even said repeatedly that the best way to play Chinese growth is to have commodities exposure, not Chinese companies. He said this repeatedly, time and time again, for many years.
That makes a lot more sense. That makes a lot more sense, you know, because ultimately they're going to need the commodities. And anytime you insert a management team in there, there's the potential, if not the likelihood, for people to siphon money out of the business and or to commit fraud or just mislead shareholders and lie to people. So, you know, if you want to own a Chinese mining company, just go out and buy gold. You know, you can have your own little mining company where if the price of spot goes up, you make money. And if it goes down, you lose money. And there's very little chance that somebody's going to fuck something up in the middle. You know, you just add such a huge layer of risk when you talk about these types of, you know, Chinese mining companies.
Well, the fraud you were describing.
There's just no, like, in my mind, based on my experience and working with Chinese nationals, okay? I've sat alongside of Chinese nationals 5 days a week for 5 years and have extensive experience. I'm not a super expert, but I have more experience than the average person on the ethos of the Chinese government, the ethos of business in China, and Chinese-based U.S.-listed companies. In my opinion, there's just never a reason to own one. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, unless you're an accounting wizard and you can send auditors out there. Even hedge funds got fooled, though. Look at the Sino Forest scam. You had billion-dollar hedge fund managers worth lots of money sending their analysts out there, sending their auditors, and they still got fooled.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely.
So if deep pocket investors get fooled, the average Joe or Jane out there, I would just avoid it. It's not worth the risk.
It's not. And, you know, there's just, you know, if you're looking for a way to make quick money, there's other ways to do it. You know, if your thesis is, oh, I found something, it's going to double, it's going to triple, or it trades at a low PE, or whatever has enticed you to this company in China, there's something similar in the U.S. that plays by the U.S. regulatory rules and plays by the U.S. accounting standards and can be driven to or flown to in less than, 4 or 5 hours to confirm that they exist. I don't know. To me, it's just, there's really just no reason to own anything based in China, even the big names. And I'm not saying that they're frauds. I'm not saying this, that, and the other, but there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about Alibaba. There's a lot we don't know about JD, which admittedly was a company that I even owned at one point. There's a lot we don't know about Tencent. There's a lot we don't know about Baidu. Hey, some of them are probably legit. Some of them might not be. But why the hell would you even, you're right from the get-go, you're starting on a non-level playing field. At least with U.S. listed companies, everybody's being held to the same standard. And then if people commit fraud from there, you're like, okay, they committed fraud from kind of a higher bar. With the Chinese companies and the foreign filers, the bar is just so low to begin with that it's just so enticing and so easy to commit fraud. So I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert, but in my opinion, Main Street investors, it shouldn't be for them. And so when I hear Trump say things like, we got to get our retirement funds out of Chinese companies, I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah. Like, and why didn't this happen 5 years ago? It's not like not enough companies haven't blown up, Jason.
Wall Street's making too much money on fees. The Wall Street banks are making way too much money on these on these deals on fees.
Yeah, you're right.
Because, didn't Dan David say he took the research reports right to the Wall Street investment banks, and the Wall Street investment bank said, fuck you. If you publish this, we'll sue your ass. They didn't want the truth. They wanted to protect their profits, and they hid behind their lawyers.
Well, Dan did a lot. Dan, even in the 5 years that I worked with him, he lobbied Congress. He had lobbied Congress, right? Like when I first started, he was really fairly active in trying to affect change and get legislators, policymakers, make them aware of the severity of the problem. I mean, I know that he met with guys like Steve Bannon. He met with guys like, I think he had a dialogue with Marco Rubio. I think that, he was, I mean, it wasn't for the want of trying. I know for certain that Dan really tried to affect change and really tried to make a difference. And at the end of the day, you're right. He did go to all these, I think he went to the banks. He went to the banks that were underwriting the deals. Nobody wanted to listen to him. And, I think in a lot of cases it was the fees. And if you watch the China Hustle, you'll see some of the guys that helped with these reverse takeovers and helped bring these China companies public. But nobody wanted to listen. And then just a couple of years ago, Dan even ran for Congress here locally under the guise of, here's what my background was in the private sector. And actually, even believe it or not, his opponent, who is now, I think, a congresswoman, Madeline Dean, had business dealings in China at the time that weren't disclosed or something on her election form. And he went in and found all this stuff. And, there's just a lot of money going back and forth from China. It's wild, but you can't say Dan didn't try to affect change because he really did. And, there's all the people in that movie, guys like Carson Block, who did NQ Mobile back in the day, and Citron and Kerrisdale and Matt Weichert and Soren, all these brilliant fucking guys that were on this stuff way early, and just nobody paid attention to it. It's just sad. It's crazy that now, people are finally paying attention to it, because you got to understand, Jason, 3, 4, 5 years ago, I'm sitting around wondering why nobody's doing anything about this, because it's so egregious, especially when you're working on it every day. You're like, oh my God, like this is perverse. It is perverse how much the American people are getting ripped off. So it really was. And then just a year or two ago, you heard Marco Rubio start kind of flapping his gums about it a little bit, and then nothing happens. And you just say, all right, well, I guess nothing's going to happen. But now it looks like it's become a major issue. And all I can say that it's, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years too late. But glad we're doing it, though.
Yeah, I would say better late than never. I mean, part of the problem though is the wolves on Wall Street. So when you were describing some of the things that were happening with these companies, how the frauds were worse than just accounting frauds, that they actually didn't have any of the assets that they were claiming, it sounded a lot like the Wolf of Wall Street movie, how Leonardo DiCaprio's character, based on Jordan Belfort, was selling small investors this story stock of enormous growth, of all these assets that were going to explode in size. And the reality of these companies was, it was a rotting warehouse, or they had no assets.
Right.
Yeah, so it was very similar. The stuff you were describing was similar to the Wolf of Wall Street scam from decades ago.
Yeah, just plain old fraud. It wasn't, there's creative accounting, I guess, in the sense that somebody had to be creative in coming up with fake numbers to put in there, but it wasn't some intricate, it wasn't an Enron style, hey, we got to move stuff off the balance sheet type fraud. It was like, no, we're just going to lie and say that there's stuff in these boxes or oil in these tankers when there isn't. And that's what a lot of these frauds are.
Yeah, the Enron off-balance sheet accounting now, Chris, we have to save that for the Fed and the other central banks, because at this point, that's what the Ponzi scheme, that's all it is just bailouts and rules changes. That's basically all that's left.
Yeah, and it's very sad, and it is going to result in severe consequences somehow. The question is how and when. But, watching it happen now and watching it take place, even prior to the pandemic, Jason, all I could think about was that it's an unprecedented road that we're going down in terms of monetary policy, and it's going to have unprecedented consequences. And, that's a certainty. It's a mathematical certainty. It's an economic law certainty that, it is definitely going to be the case. The question is just when and how. Now that the Fed has brought rates back to zero and done unlimited QE and essentially launched, the bazooka, as they call them, it's never been clearer to me that we are going to reap what we sow. And I'm sure the middle class will wind up paying for the brunt of it one way or another. But the chickens will come home to roost eventually at some point, buddy.
Yeah, unfortunately, I see a lot more stagflation in taxes and less freedom, and that's probably the best case scenario. But this crisis has allowed the governments and the central banks to create even more currency units at a faster and faster pace, because the excuse is, oh, we have to do it because of the crisis. So, the airlines have to get bailed out. Well, what about the airline workers? What about those Hertz workers, many of whom had a defined benefit pension plan? What happens to them because of this crisis? I mean, it looks like I haven't seen the exact details on their pension plans, but some of them may lose all their pension plan despite working there at Hertz for many, many years.
Yeah, it's, unfortunately, when a company is as mismanaged as Hertz and cannot survive a couple of months of, and I understand companies need to do business, stay in business, but Hertz has been around long enough that they could have built up a monstrous balance sheet and a fortress of a balance sheet and been just fine now. And yes, I know the business was deteriorating due to Uber and things like that to begin with. But, part of the blame goes to management. The other part of the blame goes to the government for forcing everybody to shut down. And I don't know how you want to distribute that blame one way or the other, but the government is, again, picking and choosing what businesses get bailed out. It says, all right, airlines are more important than rental cars. Well, why? Why is that? Why are airlines more, And the people in government are stupid. They think that if a airline goes bankrupt, it means that the planes are going to disappear off the runway, when really all a bankruptcy is it just allows a new competent management team to come in and restructure the debt of the business and start over and, keep many of the assets. And, so people don't know what bankruptcy is. They don't understand it. That leads to making terrible, terrible decisions, setting these double standards. It's just one giant shit show. It really is. Nobody has a clue. Nobody understands what's going on. Nobody understands the proper way to fix it. And again, we're going to reap the consequences of all that at some point. I wish I had better news for you. Shit.
Well, I think truth is important because then people could prepare. And what worries me the most is that a lot of people who are not going to take the time to look at your work or look at my work are going to blame capitalism, because that's the mentally easiest thing to do, is when governments and central banks make a mess of everything, make everything even worse than it already was before the coronavirus. It's just mentally easier to just blame capitalism. You don't have to spend any more time on it. It's just really easy. It's a punching bag where hardly anyone defends it.
Yeah, and like Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So if the government gets an opportunity to bail out their friends and socialize these losses after 10 or 11 years of privatizing profits, then that's what they're going to do. That's their playbook. And it's a playbook that leaves out Main Street. It is a playbook geared towards elected officials, geared towards the extraordinarily wealthy and people in that circle. And it is just taking things full circle back to our example of printing $50,000 per person, but only giving 1,200 of it to each individual citizen, right? It's just Main Street just gets the shaft again, similar to what happened in 2008. In this case, everybody on Main Street is focused on trying to stay alive and not care about their family and their friends. It's a very emotional time. So a lot of the outrage that would be lopped upon Wall Street, central bank, outrage that is very justified, is unfortunately being kind of suppressed and squelched here because people have other things to worry about. And I think that works to the benefit of the people in power. And I think they're taking full advantage of that, Jason. I think they know that, and they're taking full advantage of that.
Unfortunately, I agree. They're also looking at cashless society and a government cryptocurrency. So it looks like that's going to be in the next couple of years. China maybe first with that crypto yuan, but other governments are certainly looking at the technology where they can where they can tax and trace every single transaction. So if you or me criticize the government, we're paying an extra tax, or they're shutting down our bank accounts or credit cards.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's far off. I think one of these derivatives of a sound money, I don't know what it's going to be, whether it'll be just the fiat the way that we have it now, or it'll be the digital fiat or whatever. But one of these derivatives is going to finally break the fiat system. I don't know when, and I don't know how. One of the great things about cash is it can't be tracked, and you don't need to be a money launderer or a drug dealer to, experience those benefits. Sometimes it's just nice to have a couple $100 in your pocket and go to the strip club where you don't want to, you don't want to charge showing up on your credit card thing saying Delilah's Den, Las Vegas, Nevada. You just want to go in and you want to be discreet about the way that you spend your money that you earn, that you worked for, right? Which is yours. And the idea of being able to track people's spending of their cash is horrifying. It's just absolutely horrifying, which is why it doesn't surprise me that that's probably what will come next. Bitcoin seeks to address a lot of these issues. And I talk about Bitcoin all the time because people on my podcast are always asking me about it. And I love the problems that Bitcoin seeks to solve. The unlimited printing of money, the keeping things anonymous, keeping things person to person, keeping the central banks out of it, keeping any intermediaries out of it. Like, I love that stuff. I just think that governments will have their way with Bitcoin. And I think what will likely happen, if I had to guess, is we will have a digital dollar. And we already have a digital dollar, Jason. When they want to print more money, they're not printing money. They're moving commas over on a fucking spreadsheet at the New York Fed somewhere, right? But when we get a digital dollar, I think that will be used as an impetus to make Bitcoin illegal. And I think Bitcoin will eventually become illegal. I think it will be banned. And I think Bitcoin wallets will be banned and things like that. So I'm not sold on Bitcoin for the long term. I love the solutions that it proposes to very real problems, but I don't know. To me, gold solves a lot more of those problems than Bitcoin. If the government makes Bitcoin illegal and they want to confiscate it, well, they can, look at the blockchain ledger and see what's going where. If the government wants to try to make all gold illegal, it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to try and figure out who has what gold, when, where, and how. What's been absconded with, what's been lost, what's been kept. So I don't know. All I know is for many thousands of years, gold has been the only real money. And I think that that's going to continue to be the case, no matter how many times the Fed or the government wants to paper over it with something else.
Well said, Chris. I want to thank you so much for your time today. If my listeners want to check out your QTR podcast, how did they do so?
Sure. Well, you can just put a link in the YouTube description or whatever, and they can go down and click there. But I think most of your people, they might know me, and if not, let them find me on their own. It can be organic. I don't want to be promoting my own stuff, but I appreciate you having me on, and I'm really happy for you and the success that your channel's had. So thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.